Hi, my name's Itali, and in this video I'll show you how I add textures to my pictures using layers and blend modes. If you'd like to see more content like this, consider subscribing to my channel. Before I add texture to my images, I do like to make sure I have at least fully shaded the picture. So I have got a base layer here, which is just a grayscale fully shaded picture. Then I've got an overlay layer on top, which has my lighter and darker markings, and a color layer above that to apply color to the picture. Now there are plenty of free sites in which you can download textures, but I actually like collecting my own textures, so I have a selection of different textures here, which I've taken photographs of myself. The key to this is making sure it's not in direct sun. A cloudy day is a good day to take pictures, and usually you want to try and make sure the focus isn't in the middle of the picture like it is in this one. You want it to try and be a focus across the whole thing, as you do want a flat image. Now, despite this, I actually really like this texture, so I'm going to start with this one, and I'm just going to grab it in the layer order and shift it down to be just above my base layer. You can see it automatically applies the clipping layer, as I do have clipping layers above it. If you don't have access to clipping layers, then you may need to actually cut out the area around that you don't want applied to the picture. You can do this by selecting the area around your character, your base layer, and then going to your texture layer and cutting out that selected area. Now I'm going to change the blending mode of this layer so that it better integrates with the layer below it, which is my monotone base layer. Now there's several different blending modes you can try. My favorite is overlay. I find it usually gives me the best result if I want both the dark and the light areas on my texture to affect the picture below. I then make manual adjustments to where the texture is positioned by using the transform tool. Because this texture does have areas that are blurrier than others, I want to make sure that the less blurry areas are on the drawing that I want to be in focus. I will also sometimes copy and paste areas that are more in focus so that the pattern itself is overall is more in focus, and that I don't lose some detail that the texture is actually providing. You may also want to reposition some of the texture if it doesn't fit the form of your drawing. So obviously when it comes to scales, they don't all go in the same direction, in the same pattern, no matter what way the dragon is standing. So you may want to cut parts out and rotate them so it follows the sort of flow of the dragon, like the bend in this neck here. This is kind of important if you do want your textures not to look flat or not to look like what they are, which is just a texture applied to a layer. You do want them to look more integrated to your images, so it is important sometimes to use the transform tool or the skew tool, which I'm using here, to make your textures more involved or more part of your picture and not just a square texture that you've just set a blending mode on. Now I don't intend to keep the texture on the fin, so I'm not really paying close attention to where the border lines are if they're crossing the membrane of the fin, as I will most likely be erasing that or applying a different texture to the different areas of the dragon where a different texture would actually apply. Once I'm happy with where all the texture is positioned, I sometimes blur in some of the more obvious borders between my cutouts, just to make sure that it's not really obvious that I've used several cuttings of the same texture, and it's a bit more blended in. Now I don't actually want to keep the colors that have come with this texture, so I will be making this a grayscale image. You can do that by going to your layer or using the effects options and either clicking grayscale or going to hue saturation and dropping the saturation right down to nothing. Once that's done, I will turn the opacity down a little bit, as this is a bit of a strong texture and I don't want it to overpower my image. Now there are some areas on this picture that I want to have less texture. as I want them to be perceived as smoother or less rough. So I'm going to grab the eraser tool and just turn the opacity down on that tool and softly erase away the areas I want to be smoother. The reason I'm doing this at a lower opacity is so the texture doesn't just suddenly cut off. There is a little bit of a blend where the texture joins the area that is not textured. I also don't want any texture on the eyes, so make sure to remove texture from eyes. It's kind of weird to have textured eyes. As mentioned before, I didn't want this texture on the fins, so I'm also erasing away any texture that crossed over the line on the fins. Now I did notice I had a small patch on the neck that I had missed, so luckily I still have this texture saved in my clipboard, so I just paste it back in again to fill that gap and then turn the saturation back down again. Because I haven't made any other adjustments to this texture yet, I haven't changed anything like brightness and contrast, I was free to do this. If you have made adjustments like that, it might be a bit more difficult for you to patch this, but you could of course just select an area on the dragon that does have the texture, copy it and paste it back into the missing spot. Now I'm happy with how my texture layer is looking. I turn back on my other layers, like my overlay pattern layer and my color layer above it. If you'd like to know how I came to these steps, there is another video which is about using color layers, which you can find the link for at the top of this video. Once you do have your other layers on, you may decide that you need to make some further changes to your texture layer. In my case, I've decided I don't want the scales to appear lighter. I'd prefer the scales to appear darker and the spaces in between the scales to be lighter. So I will just be making some adjustments here by going into the layer again, and I'm going to actually flip the white and black areas of this image by turning on the negative. So now where it was white, it's now black, and where it was black, it's now white. So you can see now I have these black looking scales with lighter parts in between, which do make the scales pop out a lot more than what they did beforehand. So just remember, if a texture isn't looking right, maybe just flip it and see how it looks with the negative version of the texture. Now to make the texture pop even more, I am actually going to color in the scales on my original layer a darker shade of grey, so that when the overlay layer applies to the image, it will actually make these scales look darker and more defined overall. So I'm just using the texture as a guide as where to place these scales, and you can see here I'm just coloring in the sort of scale texture that my image has provided for me, just to make a couple of the scales pop out a bit more and make it more defined as a texture overall. Now there's nothing stopping you from layering multiple textures on top of each other, so that's exactly what I'm going to do now. I'm just going to follow the same process I did with my previous texture. This one's a more even texture, so I won't have to cut and paste things around as much. I am still going to make it a bit larger and make some small adjustments to it, but basically I'm following the same process. I make it an overlay layer. Now this is kind of a pretty color pattern, so you may actually want to keep this and just turn the opacity down, or make some adjustments using the hue and saturation, maybe change the colors around. You could also play around with the different blend modes, as you might find a pleasing blend mode to complement the existing texture. Once I've finished making adjustments to this, I do just make it a grayscale image and apply it to the existing texture. So I now have two texture layers with the opacity turned down, and I do think it does add something to it. It just kind of adds a random pattern to the scale pattern I had already applied. Now next I'm just going to use a texture to make the image look like it's made out of stone. So I'm not going to use my color layer for this one. Basically all I'm doing is changing my mossy rock texture to an overlay layer, and you can see it kind of already looks like it's made out of stone. I will make some small adjustments to this, like turning down the opacity a little bit, and I will actually get my eraser out and I'll get a textured eraser so it has it doesn't have a smooth edge, it's kind of spiky. And I'm just going to take chunks out of my bottom layer so that it's a less even of a surface and it's more of a believable stone statue. I do also take the pupil out of the eye, as statues don't normally have vivid or very defined pupils, and I think it kind of looks more like a not living creature if you remove the pupil. So now it looks more stony. The Great Stone Dragon. Now, because this texture is quite heavy, I haven't really turned the opacity down much on it. I have lost some of the definition that my bottom shaded layer has. So I am actually going to put a multiply layer on top of the overlay texture layer just to add another layer of shading to it and to add some color back into it, so it's not just the gray color. It makes it sort of fit more in your environments and makes it look more three-dimensional. So now we're going to try out a new texture. I've got this veiny rock texture we're going to use. I'm not going to be using the two textures we used previously, and I have also adjusted the color of the dragon, so you will see it's a slightly different color to how it was before. I'm just going to follow the same process we did with the other two textures. So once I have it in place, then I will be making it a grayscale texture, and then we'll be making some other adjustments using the blur and the sharpen options. Now I have got this texture still on the overlay blend mode, and I do try out the blur to see how it looks, but I don't like it, so I decided to try the other way. Let's see how sharpen looks. And I do think that looks better, so I decided to stick with the sharpen option. After adjusting the opacity a little bit, I do decide to turn the image negative so that the veins are actually white instead of black, and to try out the screen blend mode on it instead. And I do think this looks cool. It kind of has like a leathery look, so I decided to stick with this leathery texture and just erase away the parts in which I didn't want the texture to be applied. Now for the final texture, I'm going to use this sandstone texture, and rather than having my dragon look like it has scales or a leathery skin, I actually want it to look like it is drawn on paper. So make the same adjustments I do normally. I shrink it down using the select tool and put it in position, and then I use the overlay option, the same as I did for the first few textures. After turning my texture to a grayscale again, I find that the texture isn't quite popping the way I wanted it to, so I decide to use the brightness contrast option to push the values of this texture a bit more, and just to lighten it up a bit as it was a little bit dark. Now at the moment it doesn't look much like paper texture, and that's because it doesn't have any kind of background, so I quickly pop a background underneath my base layer. But when I merge these two together, I find because I've been using a clipping layer all along, I do have to cut out the parts which go past the original border of my monotone layer. So I'm just using the select tool here just to cut off from my markings layer and my color layer, so that it doesn't affect the background layer I have applied. And now you can see it kind of looks like paper because of the roughness of that concrete or sandstone that I used before, and because there's a background there, it looks like it's across the, well, it's across the whole thing rather just applying to the dragon itself. And that's the end of my tutorial on how I use textures. I hope you found it helpful. Let me know in the comments down below if I missed anything. Here's all the textures applied to the different dragons that I did during the video. Thanks everybody for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe if you'd like to see more, and I also have a Patreon if you'd like to support me. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!